Good afternoon, everybody. I see that people are still signing in for today's webinar, so thank you very much for spending your afternoon with me. Before I get started, just a couple of things. As you're looking at the panel, hopefully everybody can see my screen. If you cannot, please post a message in the chat. Also, if you can't hear me or if there is a delay, please also post a comment in the chat about that. At the bottom is where the chat is. Right above that, there's a link that says handouts and it says 2 of 5. So please feel free to click on that and download the 2 handouts that I had made available in there if you had not already done so. I'm going to wait about 2 minutes longer before I get started. We had 79 people registered for today. We've got about half of that logged in so far. So I'm just going to wait a little longer before we get started. It should have popped up a survey question for you to have the opportunity to take. If you don't see that, it is also in that panel off to the right-hand side, just above where the handouts link is. So you have the option to do that as well if you just want to do that while you're waiting. Okay, our numbers are starting to stabilize. I don't see any additional people starting to log in. So let me get started. I want to say thank you all for being here today. Again, my name is Tina Beard. I'm the owner of Tamarack Genealogy. I'm going to talk a little bit about the pandemic of 1918 and 1919. I'm going to do my best to stay on time and stay as close to an hour as I can so that any of you who have questions will be able to ask those in the chat as we get to the end of the presentation. As many of you have been seeing in the news, there have been a lot of comparisons lately to what's going on in 2020 to what was happening during the pandemic of 1918 and 1919. So throughout the course of this, I might make some comparisons, but I want people to realize that it's very hard to know where you are in the middle of a pandemic while you're in the middle of a pandemic. So while a lot of people are comparing the counts and what's going on around the world to what happened in 1918, until we get through this and until we get past it, we really can't make those comparisons. I would say that we are probably closer to the numbers that were seen during the pandemic of 1957 or even the pandemic of 1922 more than the catastrophic numbers that we were seeing in 1918 and 1919. But again, we're just at the start of this, so it's really, really hard to say. So how did it get started? What happened? How did we wind up in the situation that we were in? So at the very beginning, the first cases of an unusually potent flu were coming out of Haskell, Kansas at the end of February. So there were a lot of pig farms in that area, and there were hundreds upon hundreds of pigs who were coming down with swine flu. That, they believe, is what transitioned from swine flu to humans, and what initially was the first wave or that first flu outbreak that began in the spring of 1918. So you see it in pigs in February. You start to see an unusually virulent strain of the flu in humans in that same area as early as March 4th. Sometime within that week, between like March 3rd and March 8th, there were a couple of pig farmers who had taken their pigs over to Camp Funston and had sold that meat to the base. So within that first week between March 4th and March 11th, what matches up with what you would typically see with the incubation period for the flu, which is typically 48 to 72 hours, you start seeing soldiers coming down with influenza, potentially from those men who were bringing the product into Camp Funston. Now, there was really nothing truly remarkable about that first wave of the flu that starts in Camp Funston in early March of 1918. You had a lot of soldiers who became ill fairly quickly. by the end of the month, you had about 1,100 soldiers on the base who were reporting ill with the flu. The good side, or the positive out of all of that, was the fact that those numbers were still within what the normal range would be during a typical flu season. So when people talk about typical flu seasons and about mortality rates or morbidity rates during the flu, they talk about a 0.02% of the population. So the few soldiers who were passing away from the flu at Camp Funston were still within that 0.02% of those who would normally contract and come down with the flu at that particular time. What a lot of Army bases were worried about in the spring of 1918 wasn't the flu, and certainly pandemic was not something that was on their minds. They were dealing with measles outbreaks. They were dealing with, other types of viral infections that were running their course through the military bases. The flu wasn't something that they were concerned about at that time. So you see in this photo here, the recuperating men who were recovering from the flu at Camp Funston in March of 1918. So in the spring, if any of you had ever read John Barry's book, The Great Influenza, it's one of the books that I recommend in the bibliography that's within your handouts. John Barry spent decades researching the pandemic, and he refers to what starts to happen in the spring like a pot of boiling water. So you start to see these bubbles of pockets of the flu that are springing up in different places all across the world. So yes, we have the flu that's particularly virulent among US troops, among US bases in March of 1918, but you also start to see unusually virulent strains of the flu in places like England, and you start to see them in places around the globe in April and May of 1918. So as the flu is running its course through the military bases within the US in the spring, it starts to come with the men who are beginning to travel overseas. So as those first units of men are going in April and May, they're boarding the ships at Fort Dix, they're heading over to Brest, France, and they're starting to intermingle with the troops, the British and the French troops who are already at the front lines. You're getting reports from not only US doctors, but from British military doctors and from French military doctors that there is this really abnormally strong bronchitis and pneumonia that is popping up in 10% of the flu cases that they're seeing within their ranks. By April and May, tens of thousands of cases of these new strains are reported. So you start to see it affecting not only US troops, but you see it really decimating German forces, French forces, British forces, right as summer is beginning to start. So while we think of the pandemic in three waves, where you have the wave in the spring that affects the US troops from March to June, then there's kind of a lull, and then people think of the second wave as being from September of 1918, spiking and decreasing in December of 1918. It really never dies down. It just kind of goes, as they've referred to it, it goes dormant, it goes underground. It's like a forest fire. So where the trees catch on fire, it then goes down and burns the roots and then springs back up in another location. So when John Barry talks about the idea of that pot of boiling water, that's really a good way to look at it, because you start to see it springing up in the US, and then you see it in England, and then you see it in France, and then they start to see it in other places in May and June. You see unusually high cases in India and in China and in Shanghai and in places like New Zealand. And this is all going on in that late spring heading into summer. What winds up happening is not only is it decimating the fighting armies of Europe, where you have 40,000 British soldiers who are too sick to report to the front, but you also see it start to strike with an unusually high number of civilian casualties as well. So you see Germany has 225 deaths nationwide during this time. France has 135,000. Great Britain has 225,000 civilian deaths. This isn't even including the number of troops who are getting sick or the number of soldiers who are dying. And this is all taking place in the spring of 1918. So while it's run its course in the military camps and bases in the US, it's really wreaking havoc at the same time across the globe. The US really doesn't report on what's going on around the rest of the world about this flu pandemic that's sweeping through, towns in India like Bombay and Calcutta. They're not talking about what's going on in Shanghai. They're not talking about what's going on in Hong Kong. They're really hyper focused on the mobilization of US troops in the United States at the time. So you don't see a lot of reporting within the US about what's going on. But if you start to look at things like the London Times, if you start to look at things like the Scotsman newspaper in Edinburgh, you get these types of reports about what's going on around the rest of the world. So what begins to happen? So you've got those bubbles percolating in the United States, you have them percolating in Europe, they start to percolate in Asia and around the globe. And as US starts ramping up and starts sending more and more soldiers to the front in the summer into the early fall of 1918, you see those numbers start to boomerang back around to the United States. So for example, Camp Dodge is a really good example. I had several soldiers from Plainfield who were stationed at Camp Dodge. So as Camp Dodge is revving up to head overseas, they've boarded their troop trains to leave Camp Dodge. They're heading to Fort Dix to board their transport ships to go overseas. A few of the men start to come down with flu-like symptoms again, all over again. In that journey, from the time that they leave New Jersey to the time that they arrive on the coast of France, you have dozens of men who are now sick from the flu. What was happening with US troops, a great example would be to look up the Leviathan and read the horror stories of the men who were on board the Leviathan, where 10,000 men came down sick aboard one single ship on one single journey. What's happening is they're in such close quarters because they're doubling, and in some cases like the Leviathan, they're tripling and quadrupling the number of men who can be safely on board a ship, that when you're in such close quarters, you have, a domino effect, dozens after dozens after dozens of soldiers who are getting ill. And that's what happens to the 313th Engineers on their way overseas to France. So shortly after they land, the captain of their company, Company A, Captain Honeyman, dies from the flu, along with several other soldiers. So here's where we get our first kind of indication that something is seriously wrong. In August of 1918 is when you start to see the first reports in US newspapers about something being unusual about this particular influenza. So by the fall, from August until October of 1918, it runs through the US troops who are stationed overseas. So those men who are currently in Europe, who are currently in France, you have 35% of those fighting men who are sick. So out of 102 million men, you have 340,000 who are hospitalized with the flu. To kind of give you an idea about how immense of a number that is, in that same period of time when you had the heaviest fighting along the front, there were only 270,000 men who were in the hospital with wounds, battle wounds. So you had 70,000 more men who were hospitalized with the flu during that time than the number of men who were wounded because of battle. By the time all of this is over, you'll have 43,000 men who will have died overseas alone while fighting on the front in Europe. Here's an example at the National Archives in College Park, Archives 2. They have what they call the US name file of dead and severely wounded casualties. This is for the AEF. This is for the American Expeditionary Forces. So this card file that's available is only for the men who had died while in the AEF were stationed overseas. But as you can see in this one unit alone, I just pulled 4 representative card samples out of the box. And you could see that all of these men died of the same thing. They all died of complications from influenza and the preceding pneumonia that came while they were stationed overseas. And you see September 28th, September 28th, September 29th, September 27th are when all of these men are passing away from their illness. Now, these cards are not online. They're only available in person at the National Archives 2 in College Park. But there are other examples that I'll mention as we go forward about how to dig deeper into these types of records and get at these numbers. So I mentioned that boomerang. I mentioned that effect of it coming right back to the States. So we started to see trickles of soldiers who were returning from France and civilians who were working as part of the war effort returning in July of 1918, and they were immediately being quarantined on the military bases along the eastern seaboard. So as early as July, you get reports from the Boston Navy Yard that you've got soldiers sick. You hear about soldiers being sick at Fort Dix, but it's not escaping into the general public. The first time that you start to get reports of it seeping out into the general public is an AP article that was picked up by newspapers talking about an ocean liner that was returning to the United States that had several ill passengers on board. So they talk about how 4 people fell victim to the influenza, but they also had 21 cases on board that ship. Here's where I make my comparison of what's going on then to what's going on now. So you talk about people who are symptomatic and you talk about people who are asymptomatic. So at the time that this ocean liner is returning, you have 21 cases of people who are symptomatic and 4 people who have died. When those people disembarked from that cruise and they went back to their homes, many of them were already ill but hadn't started to show signs yet. So you start to see this uptick in towns and communities along the eastern seaboard from people who were sick but weren't actually showing signs of being ill just yet. So what made this influenza so unique? So in 2020, they referred to the novel coronavirus. Virus. That's exactly what's happening here as well. This is really a novel influenza virus. So it's affecting people outside of what would typically happen in what they call an endemic, which is a normal flu year, and moving it towards epidemic and eventually pandemic status. So like I said, in a normal flu year, you would have about 0.02% of people who would succumb to influenza in any given year. That's the average. What is so unique to this one is that the number of mortality climbs to 2.5%. So think about that. You go from 0.02 to 2.5. That's a 25% or 25 time increase in your fatality rate. And this flu isn't killing the people that you would normally expect to be susceptible to the flu. It's not killing the young and the elderly at as intensive rate as you would expect it to. You know, it's not attacking people who have underlying medical conditions. It's attacking the young, it's attacking the healthy, it's attacking the people who in that 20 to 45 age bracket that normally would not succumb and become ill to what would be an endemic or a typical influenza virus. So by the fall, you have cases around the globe. So what we see in the spring, what we see in France and in England in April and May, what we start to see around the world, Switzerland, Portugal, Greece in May into June, India and China, you run into Norway and New Zealand and Denmark starting in late July into August, that this really has covered the globe from Argentina to Antarctica to China to Canada. You have people all around the globe who have now contracted this particularly virulent, unusual, novel strain of the influenza. What's also unique to this is that it knows no boundaries. You know, it's not affecting one socioeconomic status. It's not affecting people by color. It's not affecting people by denomination or by race. You know, young or poor, rich or, you know, old, it doesn't matter. Everybody has the opportunity to be felled equally here. So some famous people who contract the flu but survive. Walt Disney, a 16-year-old ambulance driver in France, comes down with the flu. Mary Pickford comes down with the flu. When I talk about Philadelphia, in a little bit, Mary Pickford is at that rally, comes down with the flu and survives. And then Bess Wallace, who eventually comes, you know, marries um, Truman, you know, becomes our first lady. She comes down with influenza and survives. And at the Presidential Library in Independence, Missouri, the Truman Library, there are dozens of letters. They're fascinating to read between Bess Wallace and her fiance, you know, a lieutenant who's stationed overseas in France, talking about what's going on at home in the US and about what's going on with men in his unit. So they're fascinating letters to kind of give you a personal feel for how it was affecting civilians as well as military personnel. You know, Assistant Secretary of the Navy Franklin Delano Roosevelt also contracts the flu and survives. The death toll is what's truly underreported and what's truly catastrophic. So the life expectancy in the US in 1917 was 51 years old. So for all of us who are right about that age or older, I'm going to draw a sigh of relief that our life expectancy is much higher than that now. But in 1917, the average life expectancy was 51 years old. The flu took such a tremendous toll on the young within that 20 to 45 age bracket that the life expectancy drops an astounding 12 years to 39 years old. That's something that has never happened again in US history. So that number is really quite staggering. So when I talk about how it's affecting, the people in that age group that would normally be least susceptible, here's a great example of that. So Jeffrey Taubenberger, who really is an incredible infectious disease doctor, has written a lot on the pandemic and on the subsequent pandemics in years to follow, really gives a good example of that here in this chart. So you can kind of see how the dotted line is what you would normally see in an endemic flu year, where it targets the young, the healthy, the middle-aged typically do fairly well with it. And then as you increase in age, so does your opportunity to contract and die from the virus. But this one is so unique in that W pattern, the fact that it's hitting those in those most unusual age brackets. So you look at the fatality rates in 1918, you look at the fatality rates after that, and you see that spike, making it that novel influenza virus. So what does that mean? So what that means is the fact that there could have potentially been three reasons for this, and it took nearly 100 years for somebody to get to the bottom of it. So the original idea was that we were dealing with two different strains, and they collided together and caused a new, more virulent outbreak. There was a belief that once it arrived in the trenches in Europe, that the American swine flu collided with the avian bird flu in the trenches and sparked a whole new pandemic. The second theory is what they refer to as an antigen shift, and that's the theory that has kind of won out over the decades. And what that means is that the more hosts you bring to the party, the more opportunity the virus has to shift and to change. And that's what they believed happened in this particular case. And that's why they believe that those bubbles from that pot of boiling water, when you had men who were getting sick in the US, men who were getting sick in China, men who were getting sick in France and in Switzerland, all at relatively the same time, is because as those flu outbreaks were happening, the potential was there for what they call that antigen shift, that the virus shifted just enough to attack those who were susceptible to it. And when you have a lot of men, when you have thousands of men in the trenches in Europe, they're wet, they're cold, they're hungry, there's all kinds of disease that's going on in the camps, from dysentery to lice, that and the way that the structure was set up at the front was that you would spend 1 week in the rear, you'd spend 2 weeks at the front, and then you'd spend 3 weeks in the rear again. You would constantly have new hosts, constantly have fresh bodies to feed and grow and expand that flu. If men stayed in place, then everybody would have gotten sick and it wouldn't have had any place to go. But the fact that you were constantly bringing new men to the front every week, you were giving the disease the chance to spread. So those men who were catching it at the front were then taking it to the rear, and then they were getting on troop transports and they were going to other parts of France, they were going to other parts of Europe, they were going to other parts of the globe, and it just went right along with it. So when we talk about that boomerang effect and we talk about that cruise liner that comes back to the US in August of 1918, Camp Devens in Massachusetts really becomes ground zero for the pandemic spread in the fall of 1918. Through no fault of their own, they wound up being the place that spreads the virus all across the United States. So Camp Devens, which is 35 miles outside of Boston, it's a very large base that has roughly 45,000 men who are stationed in it. They had a group of men who had just returned back from Europe. They had stopped at the Boston Navy Yard for a short time. They had gotten on those trains from the Boston Navy Yard and were brought straight to Camp Devens. Now, the Boston Navy Yard was dealing with sick soldiers as early as July, so it wasn't unexpected, which is why they were kind of quarantining everybody down at the Boston Navy Yard. If you looked healthy, then they were sending you along. So when the first soldiers start to come into the hospital at Camp Devens, they don't recognize it for what it is because they were thinking that the soldiers that were arriving were clean, that they were healthy, that there were no problems. So the initial cases are diagnosed as spinal meningitis because of how quickly it affected the body, how quickly the fevers spiked, how quickly the soldiers died. So as these men are pouring into Camp Devens, they're staying in Camp Devens for roughly 3 to 4 days. Then they're getting on troop transports and being sent to their final destinations. So between September 7th and September 21st, you have thousands of troops coming into Camp Devens, getting their orders, and then being sent out. You don't start to see men showing up in the hospital in larger than a trickle until you start to get towards the end of that second week. So September 18th, September 19th, you start to hear about guys not feeling so well. You start to hear cases of guys coming into the hospital, again, being misdiagnosed with spinal meningitis. It's not until that third week of September that, pardon the expression, all hell breaks loose. On September 22nd alone, 1,543 men report sick to Camp Devens Hospital. Now, normally Camp Devens Hospital is actually one of the most well-equipped hospitals in the United States. They have 1,200 hospital beds available. They have 25 doctors on staff. They have over a dozen nurses that are ready and ready at the base, ready to help. So at that time, they only had about a half a dozen men in the hospital at that time. Somewhere from, silly wounds. A couple of people, I think, had measles or strep throat, but there was nothing. The hospital was readily available. There were very few people in it. 1,500 men show up on one day for a hospital that's meant to handle 1,200. So quickly, you're out of beds. You have men sleeping on floors. You have men sitting in chairs waiting to be seen. And that's just the first day. September 23rd, September 24th, September 25th, you've got 800, 900, 1,100 men continuing to pour into this hospital that is only equipped to handle 1,200 men. They immediately run out of space. Not only do they run out of space, but within 4 days, more than half of the medical staff is so sick they cannot even continue to work. So overwhelmed and having absolutely no idea what to do, they shut the hospital doors and do not take any additional patients on September 26th. They instantly put out a call to all of the Eastern Seaboard saying we need as many doctors and nurses as you can send. They beg the Red Cross to supply nurses that they can find. So the Red Cross the next day sends 12 more nurses. 8 of them are sick by the end of the week, and 2 of them go on to die, including Miss Margaret Sullivan, who winds up being Massachusetts' first confirmed influenza death on September 29th. Camp Devens not only is completely overwhelmed in the hospital, but Camp Devens is completely overwhelmed in the morgue as well. So a notice is written, you see it here on your screen. This was in the Camp Devens file at National Archives 2 in College Park. And it's a letter from the commanding officer saying, we will expedite the shipment of bodies as quickly as we humanly can. And you start to see that all across the United States, that military bases run out of caskets. They run out of space to even store the bodies, and they start having to stack them up, not only in the morgue, but then they start stacking them up in the hallway, and then they start stacking them up, in, commandeered barracks that they're taking over just to deal with the sheer numbers that are coming in so rapidly. So like I had said, Camp Devens really becomes that ground zero. So by the start of October, you have 100 men a day who are pouring into the hospital. You have 6,000 men within those first few days. By the end of the pandemic at Camp Devens, by the end of October, you have over 8,800 men who wind up becoming ill. That's almost 20% of the entire camp. The official death toll that was reported to the Army in December of 1918 was just under 800, and I'll show you a slide of that at the end. So there's a very large difference between the number reported and the official total. And I'll talk about that when I talk about cities and I start to talking about how that spreads out into the community. But it also has to deal with what date do they officially start recording tallies on that particular illness. How overwhelmed is the staff? Are they including the people who are dying outside of the hospital? All of these things play a part in what is officially reported. So not knowing what to do at the end of September, the U.S. Army sends, its expert virologists. It sends Colonels William Welch, it sends Rufus Cole, and it sends Victor Vaughn. Now, Colonel Welch is the epidemiological, I apologize for not getting that right. He's the expert. He has been all over the world researching viruses from Panama Canal to Asia. So he is the person that the US Army calls to try to figure out, what is this illness? What are we looking at here? So as Welch and Cole and Victor Vaughn get a tour of what's going on at Camp Devens, the men cannot believe what they have seen. Welch is so incredibly shaken that he's worried that we have a new Black Plague on our hands. So as soon as he leaves the morgue at Camp Devens, he makes 3 phone calls, and he calls his 3 most reliable virologists and says, you need to get up to Camp Devens immediately. We need to start getting samples and start doing some lab work to figure out exactly what is going on here. What are we looking at? Are we looking at a new plague? And in the diaries that are kept by Vaughn and are kept by Welch, Vaughn refers to just blood being everywhere. And you can see from his quote that's referenced in John Barry's book that, they're pouring out of the men's noses, out of their ears, they're coughing it up. Some men will cough so hard that they'll actually burst the blood vessels in their eyes. These young, healthy, ruddy boys in their teens and in their 20s, are starting to turn blue. And as he says, that blue color eventually, predicts their death. So that's one of the reasons why they start asking whether or not we're dealing with another Black Death. Are we dealing with another plague? Because what's happening is these boys are suffocating. They're turning blue because they're not getting enough oxygen, and they're basically suffocating to death. What happens in Camp Devens, like I said, slowly starts seeping out into the rest of the US population. Those boys that got on those troop trains and left between September 7th and September 14th are showing up at military bases in Philadelphia, in Louisiana, in Georgia, in Illinois. There's a group that leaves Philadelphia that same week, headed for Puget Sound. By the time they arrive at Puget Sound, you have over 300 sailors, soldiers who are on board that ship who are sick with influenza. Philadelphia is one of those worst case scenarios. So you hear a lot on the news in 2020 about what St. Louis did in 1918, about shutting everything down, having a stay-at-home order, keeping everybody in and keeping everybody safe, and about what great results that had for the city of St. Louis, and it did. But then you also hear other cases, and some of you might have heard references to Philadelphia over the last few weeks. Philadelphia is the complete opposite. It is exactly what you should never do. Philadelphia had a lot of things going wrong for it, even before the pandemic shows up at its door. So you had Dr. Cruzen, who was the director of Philadelphia Public Health. It was a appointed job. He had been on the job for a couple of months, very similar to John Dale Robertson in Chicago, which I will get to. He was appointed under Mayor Thomas Smith. Thomas Smith, at the start of the pandemic in Philadelphia, winds up getting indicted on criminal charges for corruption. At that time, Philadelphia is overcrowded. You have way too many people living in not enough housing. The tenements in Philadelphia are said to be even worse than the worst that you can imagine in New York City. Philadelphia also had a very strong machine that would make Tammany Hall blush. So Edwin Vary, who was he was the Republican state senator, was considered Philadelphia's boss. He was the guy. He was the person who was responsible for greasing the wheel. People, the street sweepers who had a contract with the city. He was the guy that took that graft money. So Vary really had his hands in everything that was going on in Philadelphia. Thomas Smith, cruising, wanted to make sure that the people of Philadelphia were not alarmed. They did everything they could to downplay, ignore, pretend, lie if need be, that there was any chance of what was going on in Boston and what was going on at Camp Devens to arrive in Philadelphia. So during September, you start to see a lot of men who are sick at the military base just outside of Philadelphia, and they played it off. Oh, that's not here. That's the military. Not our problem. We're fine. Well, that second week of September, you start having flu virus victims popping up in local Philadelphia hospitals. Oh, it's just the regular flu. Don't worry about it. It's only 2 people. It's only 3 people. It's just fine. There's no problem. Cole and Welch and Vaughn are sending messages to Philadelphia along with other virologists. You have people like Avery and you have people like Paul Lewis who are saying, you really need to lock down Philadelphia. It's starting to spread. They played it off as being no big deal. Reports in the local newspapers say, oh, don't worry about it. There's nothing, no reason to be alarmed. Well, Philadelphia was in the midst of a very large military bond drive. Their very last bond parade was scheduled to take place at the end of September. They were very, very close to reaching their goal. So Smith and Vari did not want to close the city down because they didn't want to risk reaching their goal during the Liberty Bond drive. So even though they had, about 200 people who had come into the hospital in those 2 or 3 days leading up to the parade, they said it's not a big enough number to be concerned, and held an enormous parade and rally on September 28th in downtown Philadelphia. Within 72 hours, you had tens of thousands of people who were showing up at local hospitals sick with the flu. 200,000 people were in the street that day to celebrate the Liberty Bond Parade, including, like I had mentioned, our young actress who wound up coming down with the flu. She survived, but wound up getting sick as well. So the hospital on Fifth Street is quickly overrun. They have to shut their doors because they can't take any more victims. They're just left to be out on the street. If you were well enough to go home, they sent you home to your bed and told you to stay there. Philadelphia doesn't step up to do anything about it until October 3rd. October 3rd is when they finally make the announcement that they're closing all assemblages, that they're closing school, that they're closing worship, that they're closing businesses. 5 days they let this flu run rampant through the city before they stepped in to do something about it. And as early as October 3rd, the reporting in the local paper, 243 deaths, 289 deaths, 312 deaths. The pandemic has peaked. We've reached our limit. The numbers are going to go down. All that happened were that those numbers continued to climb and to climb and to climb. You go from 200 to 300 to 400 to 600 to 700. On October 10th, 759 people alone died in a single day during this pandemic. By the time that the pandemic peaks and starts to descend, by the end of October, you have over 12,000 people in the city of Philadelphia who have perished. In the absence of any type of governmental support, any type of insight, any type of calming voice coming from Thomas Smith, because remember, he's been indicted, so he's in jail. Vari really steps up. I hate to say it, the mob really steps up in Philadelphia and is taking care of people. They're getting them doctors, they're getting them medicine, whatever they can get them. They're feeding the children, they're helping the orphans. They step in to try to pick up the slack for the complete lack of any type of responsibility from the mayor's office. And the interesting bedfellow in all of this with Edwin Vari and with the Philadelphia machine are the women's aid societies. So we're talking about, the Carnegies, the Whartons, we're talking about the big name society women who are stepping in to help as best they can as well. And one interesting thing that comes out of this is that these women's aid societies offer $10 to anybody who will pick up a shovel and help bury the dead. Not a single person volunteers. And the reason for that is just sheer fear. Since they're not getting any type of information, any truth, any honesty that's coming out of the government in Philadelphia, the sheer terror of not knowing, am I going to catch this? Can I spread this? Where does it come from? How do I get it? How do I protect myself against it? That people just flat out refuse to help bury the dead, to help collect the bodies, to go into the streets, to help people. So the morgue stacks up and fills to capacity. They start spilling out into the hallways. They start spilling out into the street. People are just putting the dead bodies on their front porches, and there's nobody to collect them. There are stories, I think Alfred Crosby mentions it in his book, about how a neighbor picks up a neighbor boy, 7 years old, who passes away, takes him to the cemetery himself and digs a grave and buries him. People are being buried in mass graves. So Charles Borromeo Theological Seminary is who steps up in this time of crisis. So while the police and the first responders are out trying to help, they're getting sick as well and passing away or being laid up at home. Charles Borromeo really steps in, and those men go out into the neighborhoods. They collect the dead, they bring them to the cemeteries, and they bury them. But as you can see in this photo that comes from the Philadelphia newspaper, that they were really just burying them in trenches and mass graves. And the understanding was, when they did this, was that people, after the pandemic, after the fear, after that terror subsides, that people are going to come back and claim their loved ones. Well, they didn't. So these people are still buried in these mass graves. This continues to spread. So you see it start to spread from the eastern seaboard into the center of the country. You see it going on in Ohio, you see it going on in Michigan and in Wisconsin, and in Illinois is no exception. So Commander Charles Hagedorn is appointed as the commander at Camp Grant in Rockford on August 8th. That summer, Welch and Cole and Vaughn had already been at Camp Grant. They had already talked to the medical staff. One of the medical staff were people who had worked directly under Vaughn and his people previously, so he was completely competent in this doctor's ability to run the hotel. It was, or not the hotel, the hospital. It was well staffed. They were full of nurses. They were in a good position. When Charles Hagedorn takes over in August of 1918, Hagedorn is kind of appalled at the fact that new recent arrivals are still staying in tents out on the parade grounds. So he orders his men to get all of the tents emptied by the end of September. He wants to make sure that all of those men who are living in temporary quarters are put into the barracks. Now, he is warned repeatedly by the medical staff that we cannot do this. We cannot overcrowd these barracks. If we overcrowd these barracks, we run the risk of disease. Commander Hagedorn won't hear any of it. He insists and pushes to make sure that all of these tents are closed by September. At that same point, as they're closing down those tents and putting these men out of their temporary quarters into the barracks, you get a set of men, officers who arrive from Camp Devens. 7 officers come from Camp Devens. They're stationed at Camp Grant temporarily. They're kind of training the officers there, and then they're supposed to leave to go on to their next destination. By September 21st, you have 108 cases who show up in the hospital by midnight of that day. The numbers continue to climb and climb and climb, because had they listened to the medical officers, if they had left these men in their temporary quarters, they wouldn't have overrun the barracks, there wouldn't have been overcrowding, and there would have been less chance for this illness to spread. As the numbers continue to climb, Commander Hagedorn is reading the news from his officers. He's seeing it in the 5 newspapers that Rockford has in the surrounding town. He had just received a report that day about several soldiers who were being transferred to Georgia, passing away on the train on their way to Georgia. He insists that he doesn't want anybody to release the names of those soldiers who are dying at Camp Grant out into the public. He wants to keep that information locked down. On the afternoon of October 8th, the 500th soldier passes away at Camp Grant. Commander Hagedorn calls his staff in. He says, I want you to go out to the parade grounds and stand at attention. I will be out shortly. They go outside. 20 minutes go by, 30 minutes go by, no Commander Hagedorn. As his secretary steps forward to go back into the building to find out what's taking the commander so long, he hears the shot fire. Commander Hagedorn commits suicide in his office on October 8th. The sad thing is this didn't stop the pandemic and it didn't stop the flu. Over the course of the next 3 weeks, you would have twice as many deaths. The official death toll at Camp Grant becomes just over 1,000 by the time it's all said and done. While Camp Grant is one of the most heavily impacted based on numbers, they are not the only camp that's being affected. Again, most camps are housing between 35 and 45,000 men. Camp Grant is no exception to that. By the time it's all said and done, you have over 12,000 soldiers sick. It still falls into that 20 to 35% that you're seeing across the United States, what you're seeing within the AEF overseas. So Great Lakes, Camp Grant, Camp Dodge, Camp Funston are just kind of good relative samples of what's going on globally. Camp Grant, just like Great Lakes, struggles to keep up with the shipments of bodies. So Camp Grant puts out a call initially to Rockford saying, please send us any coroners, any funeral directors, send us as many caskets as you can. They run out of caskets. They widen that search and start asking in Aurora and in Elgin, send us as many funeral directors, coroners, caskets as you can. Finally, they put out a call to anyone that says, please help us deal with our great morgue. Please send us as many caskets, as many funeral directors, as many embalmers as you possibly can to help us deal with the crush that we're experiencing. The problem is, at the same time that Camp Grant is going through this in late September into October of 1918, so is everywhere else. So is Elgin, so is Aurora, so is Great Lakes, so is Fort Sheridan. So there's nothing to send because everybody is scrambling to receive the same supplies at the exact same time. So just like those men who are arriving at Camp Grant who are coming in from Devens in Massachusetts, you're also getting men who are arriving at Great Lakes from Devens at the exact same time. But you also start to see it trickling out into the general population. I give Governor Loudon a whole lot of credit for acting quickly and acting responsively and getting the word out on what he wanted to see happen across the state of Illinois. So September 17th is kind of when they first start hearing about what's going on the Eastern Seaboard. He's keeping an eye on what's going on across military bases, both outside of his state as well as within the state of Illinois. And on September 25th is when he says, we need to start recording flu totals. So he starts clamping down and saying that it's important that we need to figure out what our numbers are going to be. And he establishes an emergency committee. So that committee's job is to then contact the departments of health in the counties to start regulating and requiring the recording of flu fatalities as well as flu illnesses. September 26th is the date I want you to remember because Governor Loudon puts out a notice saying that he wants the closing of all political assemblages, all public buildings, all schools, churches, and businesses. He puts the order out there, but not every city or every town decides that they're going to comply. So I work in Plainfield. Plainfield mostly complied. So Plainfield decided that they were going to lock down businesses, they were going to close schools, but they refused to close church services. So they continued to hold church and have worship, even though some churches took it outside and had what they called open air services. Starting in 1917, luckily for us, the state decided to start putting out what was called an annual health report. So for 1919, this is covering the 1918 year, they put out a report on what was going on within the state during the pandemic. And what kind of cracks me up, and I know this is a terrible thing to say because it's not funny, but what I find rather humorous is that they talk about the numbers in Illinois, they talk about the 200,000 cases that are reported, 103,000 total number across the whole state, but then they call out one single guy. And they talk about how this spreads in Southern Illinois because one guy comes home from Great Lakes or from Oglethorpe, Camp Forest near Oglethorpe. He comes home, he's not feeling very well, but he doesn't think anything of it. So he hangs out in town, he's at the post office shaking hands. Hey, Bob, how you doing? Chatting with everybody, and then decides the next day he's going to go visit his girlfriend. Well, he winds up becoming kind of that typhoid Mary example for Southern Illinois because he winds up spreading it to numerous communities, from, where he lives, in Elko, to Cairo. I mean, this guy really kind of sickens the vast majority of Southern Illinois. And I found it rather humorous that in the report, they single out one particular person in this report. So government issues health warnings. But it's not just the government that's running ads in the local newspapers. So while the government tells you stay home if you're not feeling well, cover your face so you don't spread the disease, but you also have every shyster on the planet trying to make a buck off of this. So you have people running ads about drink my flu tonic elixir, eat more onions, make sure you have onion, have garlic, eat more oranges. So you see all of these ads start popping up in local newspapers about how to beat the flu, how to survive the pandemic, how to stay well. So you're competing between what the government is putting out and what, these local con artists are trying to sell you. So there's not a lot of direction there. And unfortunately, what winds up happening is there's not a lot of information coming from the top. I'm making no commentary on what's going on in 2020 on this one, but Wilson is so focused in 1918 on the war that he kind of abdicates his responsibility to put out a unified federal response because his goal is to make sure that the troops are protected, that they're handled, that they've got the supplies that they need, and he's worried about funding it. So his goal is to continue those liberty drives because he needs that money in order to pay for the war effort. So he's really not telling people to avoid liberty drives. He's really not telling people to stay home. It's really the states, the governors, and the cities that are responsible for putting out the materials to their citizenry. Just like it spreads across the eastern seaboard, it spreads all over the state of Illinois. So here's a couple of examples that you see from Mount Carmel to Chicago to Camp Grant, to downstate Springfield. Every day, every week in the newspaper in September and October and November, you're seeing obit after obit after obit of young person who succumbs to the flu, who dies during the pandemic. The one on the far left, the Lester Schnitzer one, is out of the Jewish Sentinel, which is digitized and available through Ida, Illinois. What I love about the Jewish Sentinel is the fact that even though it's based in Chicago, it's reporting on Jewish communities and Jews all over the United States. So it talks about him having lived in Chicago once, but he really is living in Ohio and passes away in Ohio. So you can find a lot of good information by reading the local newspaper to find out what's going on during the pandemic by looking at what's going on in the communities across the state. It sparks all kinds of movements, from music to poems to poetry, about the pandemic. So how many of you have ever heard this? I had a little bird and his name was Enza. I opened up the window and influenza. That was something that they would hopscotch to, or they would jump rope to. Influenza blues. The 269th was an all-black regiment based out of Chicago. 270th, excuse me, 270th. 269th was the Harlem Hellcats that everybody's so familiar with. But the 270th, based out of Bronzeville, had numerous musicians in it, and one of them wrote this influenza blues during the course of the pandemic. In my own community, there were 42 people who died in Plainfield and were buried in Plainfield Township Cemetery in 1918. From March to December, 12 people, which isn't a huge number when you look at it, but it was 30% of all deaths buried in Plainfield Township Cemetery were flu or pneumonia deaths at that time. All but 2 of them were between the ages of 20 and 45. Like I said, it's hitting the young. Why is it hitting the young? Because the young are in more close quarters, whether it's men working at the front or fighting at the front, whether it's men and women working in factories side by side, elbow to elbow, whether it's the young ladies who are taking care of their families as school teachers, as secretaries. These are people who are out in the workforce who are being exposed every day. Like I said, Plainfield mostly followed the rules other than insisting on continuing to hold worship. Oh, let me go back. So in this article at the very bottom, they talk about Dr. Owens, and they say Dr. Owens is at home as of late because he's had a nervous breakdown, basically from dealing with so many people who are infected with the flu. And you'll see this all across the medical profession. The medical profession was hit exceptionally hard by the pandemic. So to give you a little bit of background, over 30% of US doctors and nurses were already working in some capacity with the Army or with the Navy. So we already had a decrease of 30% of our medical staff available to help pandemic victims and to fight the pandemic on the home front because they were already in the US military, helping US troops and helping the Navy. Those who were still in the United States, who are on the front lines fighting every day, are coming down with the virus, are getting sick and dying themselves. Many of them are having nervous breakdowns themselves from the overwork and just from the fear and the terror of what's going on around them, and knowing that there's absolutely nothing they can do to stop it. But there's also, sadly, an enormously high uptick in the number of suicides as well. So a lot of doctors and nurses take their own lives because of what's going on and the stress and the fear and the terror of what's going on during the pandemic. So the same things are happening at Great Lakes that are happening in Rockford, that are happening at Fort Sheridan, that are happening all over the place. That week, remember I told you between the 7th and the 14th are when those soldiers were leaving Camp Devens and they're starting to show up in these other bases around the US. Same thing with Great Lakes. September 8th, the first group of men arrive that had been coming from Camp Devens. They report to the hospital sick themselves. It starts to spread from there. The people that they met on board as they were coming to Great Lakes, the people they met when they arrived at Great Lakes. Again, nobody knows what this is because you don't start seeing the huge numbers of deaths until after September 21st. So once again, Great Lakes is no different. They're misdiagnosing it as meningitis. I have to give the camp commander tremendous credit because he did what he could with what he knew. So as soon as men started showing up in the hospital, he refuses liberty to everybody. Nobody is allowed to leave the base. Everybody is on lockdown. Those who are symptomatic are instantly quarantined. But like I was saying earlier, between symptomatic and asymptomatic, you had thousands of men who were already ill but weren't showing symptoms. So by quarantining the men who were already showing symptoms, it wasn't doing enough to quash the pandemic before it spread out of control at Great Lakes. So within a week, you had 5,000 more men who are sick because they were already out there but weren't showing symptoms yet. He tries to do the best he can. He orders all 50,000 sailors being given daily salt throat sprays, thinking that that's going to help keep them well, keep them hydrated, they'll be fine. Another thing that the commander doesn't do, which is disappointing, is while he keeps the men on lockdown and refuses liberty leave to anybody, he doesn't keep staff from coming and going. So just like you see down in Baltimore, just like you see in Virginia, the staff who work at the base are allowed to come and go as they please. So the cooks, the cleaning crews, all of those people can come and go as they want, and they just keep spreading it back and forth from the camp to their homes out into the community. Total registered flu cases as of September 26, which is still very early in the fight, is 8,400. They had 257 cases the previous day. So men are dying at an alarming rate at Great Lakes, to the point where not only do they run out of caskets, but they run out of what they call winding sheets. And you see an example of that here on the right-hand side. So what Great Lakes is forced to do is they're forced to lay men 3 deep. So you have one man on a cot and you have a man laying on either side of that cot. As these men are coming into the hospital, they're automatically being put in winding sheets, whether they're dead or not, and their toes are being tagged, assuming they're not going to survive. So as the man in the bed dies, they carry his body away to the morgue and pick the first guy up off the floor and put him on the bed. The morgue is at capacity. It is stacked floor to ceiling. The train station leaving Great Lakes has caskets from floor to ceiling all the way across the station deck. Josie Mabel Brown, who was a nurse, an 18-year-old nurse at the time, she lived to be 100 years old, and they interviewed her in the 1980s about her experiences being at Great Lakes. Now, Josie had come down with the flu herself, and Josie talks about being so sick and having fever so bad that her body shook so hard that she actually knocked the oh, I just forgot the name of it, off the edge of her bed. The clipboard that kept track of her vitals off the edge of the bed. But she talks about as the boys were brought in, they were put in these winding sheets, their toes were tagged, with their name, their next of kin, and that they just waited for them to die. All they could offer was palliative care. They couldn't do anything to make them better. All they could do would be to wipe their forehead, give them a sip of water, take care of them as they lay dying. She says that there were so many bodies stacked in the morgue from floor to ceiling that she felt terrible for the boys who were on the bottom. The U.S. Navy Surgeon General puts out an annual report every year as well. And when you look at the annual report put out in 1919 for 1918, they do talk about the nurses who were stationed across the U.S. as part of the hospital corps, and they do list those nurses who had succumbed during the pandemic. So if you know that you had a nurse who had become ill and had died, she could show up in the U.S. Navy Surgeon General's report. Cook County. I got to talk about the city of Chicago. So I apologize, I'm going to run over a little bit, but in every story, you need to have a villain. And in Philadelphia, that villain was Thomas Smith for not doing enough. That was Cruzen for not putting his foot down and saying, we have a real problem on our hands. In Chicago, that villain is John Dill Robertson. John Dill Robertson is appointed in August of 1918. It's a patronage job. He's given the position, not necessarily qualified, even though he's a doctor, to be the public health commissioner for the city of Chicago. Here's one of those where I have to take a deep breath so I don't say something inappropriate. So John Dill Robertson did everything that he could in his power to underreport, to obfuscate, to lie about what was going on in the city of Chicago. So when news comes out of Great Lakes, when he starts hearing about what's going on at Camp Grant, about the huge uptick in flu cases that start that second week of September, he reports, don't worry, we're watching it. I got my eye on it. We're going to be fine. You start to see flu cases arriving in Cook County, northern Will County, and into Chicago. John Dill Robertson on September 23rd says, don't worry, we've got the situation well in hand. We're fine. Everything is fine. We're going to be just fine. A week later, you have 260 verified cases. So when I talk about the difference between reporting and official, this is, again, just like what we're seeing in 2020, the number of verified cases versus the potential for how many out there who are carrying the virus. That same day, September 26th, remember Governor Loudon issues an order that says, I want you to shut down all assemblages. John Dill Robertson ignores it, continues on his merry way, ignores the governor, doesn't close anything down, again, continues to pretend that we've got a problem here in Chicago, and just continues on his merry way. October 1st, he agrees to quarantine those who are symptomatic. Now, this had already been going on across Illinois. It's already happening at Great Lakes. It's already happening at Camp Grant. You're already hearing about it happening in Boston and Philadelphia and Detroit and in Cleveland. So John Dill Robertson makes the minimal effort to just tell those who are sick to stay home, but it's not truly enforced. That first week of October, 40,000 residents come down with the flu. And he has the audacity that first week of October to say the backbone of the epidemic is broken. Chicago has seen the worst of it. Now remember, October 8th, everything is still open because he ignored for 2 weeks the governor's regulation to shut everything down. On October 8th, he declares that he's going to close the theater district and the entertainment centers, the wealthy areas. John is quoted in the paper as saying, what are those poor theater girls going to do? They're going to live, John. That's what they're going to do. They're going to live. But what he doesn't close down are the bowling alleys, the saloons, the pool halls. Schools are still open. He's concerned with one group of people and one group of people only, and those are the wealthy. He is quoted as bragging to his lieutenants in his department that nothing was done to interfere with the morale of the community. He didn't want to frighten anybody. He didn't want to worry people. He didn't want to scare them. So he intentionally lied to the citizens of Chicago, who just continued to do what they had always done because they figured they were perfectly safe as the numbers in Chicago climb and climb and climb and climb. He doesn't curtail public activities until October 16th, but he never closes schools. Businesses are told to close, pool halls are told to close. He never officially closes schools. At its peak, between October 3rd and October 16th, the Tribune is reporting 1,200 new cases a day that are being reported. The downside is that those in the poorer neighborhoods are dying at the most alarming rates. And the reason for that is because they're the people who still have to go to work. They don't have the luxury to stay home. They still have to feed their families. They have, they're living in close quarters. They don't have the best sanitary options available to them. A lot of these more ethnic neighborhoods, the governor and the city are not translating these public health notices into other languages. So people are just simply unaware of what's going on because either they don't read English or they're not being informed because they're not reading the local paper. Immigrant and Black communities are hit tremendously hard, not just in Chicago, in Philadelphia, in the Germantown district, in the 4th Ward in Baltimore. And the numbers that are being recorded of those that are officially tallied, the official tally that I keep referring to, don't include the immigrant and the Black communities. So when you look at numbers, 675,000 Americans perished during the pandemic, that number's startlingly higher because they weren't making sure that they were tallying what was going on in the poor, the Black, and the ethnic communities. Cook County Hospital had one of the highest mortality rates for flu victims in the entire country. It was almost 40%. Again, the reason for that is Cook County is a public hospital. People aren't going to the hospital until they're so sick they can no longer work. So people are continuing to go to work every day. They're continuing to do their business until they get to the point where they are so sick that they have to go to the hospital. And by that point, it's too late. So here's a copy of a page out of the Cook County Hospital admissions books for 1918. These are available to look at in person at the Illinois Regional Archives Depository at Northeastern Illinois University off of Pulaski, down in the IRAD Center in the basement. They're really, really eye-opening to take a look and see the number of people who are dying and the number of people who are surviving. It's a 2-page spread. So you see the day they come in, you see their names, their vitals, and then what happens to them. Do they die or are they recovered? And you see that along the column on the right. Here's that full page to give you an idea of just page after page after page of these are listed. So again, back to that official death toll. So Cook County claims that it only had 43,000 flus, not deaths. These are people who have caught the flu. So this is 43,000 people in Chicago who are diagnosed with the flu. Actually, that number is a huge misnomer. They think that, well over 200,000 people in Chicago caught the flu during the pandemic through all 3 waves. So the numbers were drastically underreported, and that's because of John Dill Robertson, because he wasn't following the governor's guidelines, he wasn't following the standards, and he wasn't requiring people to record influenza as a viable illness until weeks into the pandemic. I also talk about that official number, and that official number also plays a part in the number of doctors who have the time to fill out the paperwork on each and every person who's sick. So hospital staffs who are completely overrun with victims don't have the time to make sure that they're counting each and every person who succumbs. So you have a lot of underreporting that's going on, sometimes intentionally, like with the armies, the Allied armies, because they didn't want Germany to see exactly how sick they were. And some of it is just underreporting just simply because they are so incredibly overwhelmed. So there's a doctoral thesis that was done by a young lady a couple of years ago, and she put together a heat map of Cook County. And here's the example of it. And she talks about the number of people who are dying from the flu versus the number of people who are recovering. And you see, as you look across this map, that people in Little Village, that people in Pullman, that people in back of the yards and in Canaryville are dying at an alarming rate compared to what you're seeing on the North Shore. Again, those poor ethnic Black communities who are going untreated and underreported because they're not getting the medical help that they need. So the 3rd wave that starts in December of 1918 kind of crests in March of 1919 and dies out by May of 1919. Unusually enough, Oswego, where I live, gets hit really hard in the third wave. Somehow it manages to avoid what's going on all around it in the fall of 1918 and really gets smacked hard in December and January of 18 and 19. Other cities who are hit particularly hard in the third wave, Oakland, Portland, Phoenix, get hit relatively hard in that third wave. Globally, Australia gets hit hard. France gets hit again on a rebound. President Wilson gets sick and catches the flu while he's in Paris, leading to his stroke, which a lot of people would tell you that they think that's the reason why the Paris peace talks take such a sharp turn to ordering reparations on Germany at the time, is because after Wilson contracts the flu and then has his stroke, it really changed his brain chemistry. It changed his entire personality. And there are a lot of people who report on how Wilson's personality changes after he comes out of and recuperates from the flu. But that deadly strain, again, that antigen shifts again, whether it's because some people had already had immunity to it the first time around, or just because it's starting to go back into an endemic stage from an epidemic stage, that drops back within that normal 0.02 death toll again, as it finally runs its course by June of 1919. What are some of the effects? What's the aftermath to this? So global estimates range from 20 to 100 million infected. Actually, that number has been estimated higher, as much as 150 million. In the United States, like I said, 675,000 people are listed as having succumbed to the disease. We know that that number is woefully inappropriate because it's not tallying those who had died in the ethnic communities, in the poor communities. So we know those numbers aren't actually realistic. An estimated 25 to 30% of Americans contract the virus. That number could actually be as high as 37 to 45% of Americans contract the virus between 1918 and 1990 or 1919. Like I had said, 43,000 troops died overseas. There were another 17,000 that died in the United States, bringing the official death toll that's represented by the pandemic as being 60,000 US soldiers. I talked about Camp Devens and those official totals that are registered. You see Camp Grant says that they had, 10,000 infected cases with a death toll of 1,068. Devens had 13,000 officially diagnosed. That's not including those men who were initially diagnosed as having spinal meningitis, with an official death toll of 794. Off to the right-hand side, you see that duration. While the vast majority of them are in the late 30s to 40 days, you can see some were considerably shorter based on how many men were there and what types of treatments were given as soon as they started to appear sick. It's like I said, several doctors spend decades, the rest of their lives, trying to get to the bottom of this pandemic. Dr. Crosby, Dr. Lewis, Dr. Taubenberger, who I talked about earlier, Johann Hulton, Dr. Hulton. Eventually, they discover the RNA strands as to what made the pandemic so deadly. That's what we're familiar with as H1N1. You'll have variations of that kind of come and go throughout the decades. We had H5N3 a couple of years ago, but the strands that they were able to diagnose based on tissue samples that were taken in 1918 and doing blood work on those that had survived the pandemic, they have designated the strands as being H1N1. So if I'm looking for people who in my family might have contracted the virus but survived, it's easier to find those who die because you'll find them in obituaries, you'll find them in cemetery records, you'll find official death certificates. But what about those people who caught it and survived? There are places to look for those people as well. You can look through city and county histories. Local newspapers are a great resource because they're going to tell you those people who are on the mend, as they'll so often refer to it. Look for letters and diaries. Like I said, Bess and Harry Truman were writing letters to each other back and forth during the war. Those are at the Truman Presidential Library. The World War I Museum in Kansas City has a collection of letters written between a soldier and his family in the Quad Cities area. You'd have access to those. School records, teachers' logbooks are keeping track of the days they're out of school. They're keeping track of the students and the teachers who die, the number of people who are quarantined. On the state level, you've got Red Cross reports, you've got public health department reports, hospital records like what we saw from Cook County Hospital. You've got those official death registers and death certificates, coroner's inquest reports, National Guard files at the state archives, or the state adjutant general's office is going to have some things on that. The World War I military records are going to have things as well, like their discharge papers. If they were discharged because of illness, that would be listed on their discharge paper at the county. For federal records, I talked about the AEF, which are those men who were stationed overseas. Those records are at the National Archives too in College Park, Maryland, but there are other places to look too. The National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis has the burial transfer cases for soldiers during the First World War. So if you had somebody whose body who was shipped home, like I talked about Great Lakes, about how they were putting them on the trains and sending them back to their families, those records would be in St. Louis. Camp newspapers. Not only did Camp Dodge have a newspaper within the camp, but the city of Des Moines had newspapers. So there are all kinds of places to look for information on what's happening in the camps. Camp newspapers are one of them, and the Library of Congress has an enormous collection of those. Obviously, we're all kind of at home and can't do any in-person research at the moment. So where can I go to look for information online? So you could try online newspaper collections, whether that's Internet Archive, which has the Antioch newspapers online during this period. Chronicling America from the Library of Congress has Great Lakes Naval Base's newspaper digitized and available online. You've got Fold 3, you've got JSTOR. There are a lot of places where you can go to try to dig deeper to get to the bottom of what was going on with your family, your community, and potentially your soldier at this time. So I would recommend any of these resources. If you download the bibliography that I give you, there are a lot of additional resources about the flu. So if you want to know about how to trace your family, download the handout, the pandemic handout. That's going to have these links on there. But if you want to know more about the flu and how it affected medicine and medical science and those types of reports, download the bibliography as well. So any questions that you have for me, please feel free to put into the chat. I apologize for running over by a few minutes, but I'm delighted that so many of you decided that you wanted to spend your afternoon with me. One thing that I do want to say is that I'm actually, when I look at what's going on around us and being a historian, as a historian, I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm not a virologist. I'm not a medical professional. I'm just a historian who likes to look deeper at the trends and the hows and the whys to the events that happen in history. There are comparisons that can be made between what's happening now in 2020 and what was happening in 1918. That abdication of federal responsibility to Wilson during the war, about states and cities stepping up and telling people, what they expect of them and what they want them to do, at any given time. That information was at odds then, and that information is at odds now. And that's just something that happens. It's really interesting that if you read John Barry's book, if you get the updated version that came out in 2009, in his afterword, he makes a statement on the very last 2 pages, and he talks about, kind of what was happening. This is during the swine flu outbreak in 2009, and comparing it to what he was seeing from the federal government in the states in 1918. And he talks about the fear and how, in the absence of a calming, authoritative, honest voice, fear and terror sets in. And he gives a quote which kind of strikes me. He quotes Lincoln, and he says, his quote from Lincoln is, "A leader must make whatever horror exists concrete. Only then will people be able to break it apart." So he implores government officials in his afterward in 2009 to be honest, to do what you can to calm the people by telling them the truth. He says, "Fear of the dark is almost physical manifestation of that horror." He says, "When you lie to the American people, the terror sets in." I think that's a very true and poignant and appropriate statement to use in 2020 as well. So I'm checking the chat. I don't know why, but I'm not seeing any questions. So hopefully, if any of you do have questions and for whatever reason they might not be showing up here, you have my email address. It is on the handout. Please feel free to email me any questions or additional stories or anything that you might be willing to share with me. But I do want to say thank you to all of you who have attended. Hopefully it's offered a little bit of insight into the background of what was going on and how it may have impacted your family. One last thing I do want to say is that every family was impacted by the pandemic in one way or another, whether it was because they had somebody who had fallen ill and passed away, or somebody who had just fallen ill, or somebody who had cared for the sick, or somebody who still had to go to work every day in an essential job. Everybody was impacted by what happened globally in 1918 and 1990. So the compassion and the understanding that we bring 100 years later, looking on with sympathy what they went through at that time, all I can hope is that we look at ourselves with that same empathy and that same sympathy that we're willing to show for the people who had experienced it 100 years ago. So thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day. Stay in and stay safe, everybody.